Everybody, it seems, in our secular society is keen on diversity and inclusion. Whole careers are built on these two pillars. But do they really support each other? And what makes a society hang together? Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, secularists, have stopped killing each other by and large. How and why did this happen? And is Islam bound to go the same way? Diversity and inclusion, Fergus. Two of the great themes of our age. You can hardly get a job anywhere these days without at least theoretical commitment to these.
Absolutely, a legal requirement in across businesses, major institutions, you name it. It has become a job in itself. I think all major businesses, even smaller businesses now, employ someone whose job it is to sort of enforce this across employment practice.
But the impulse towards real diversity, recognition of diversity, and the need to get some kind of inclusiveness out of that diversity, it's pretty ancient, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's a slight narrative, I think, among the moderns, among people of our own age, that this sort of sprung fully formed in the last 3 years or the last 20 years or since the 1960s.
Yes, a product of late 20th century liberalism and secularism. And so on.
Which increasingly people realise that even those movements didn't come from nowhere. But specifically diversity and inclusion, the idea of needing to include multiple people from different backgrounds, of different beliefs, of different orientations, whatever that might mean, is profoundly ancient, because it's sort of a essential part of a functional society that isn't, if you are a tribe on the Andaman Islands, you don't need diversity and inclusion because you're not engaging with the rest of the world, but everybody else does.
And Roman law, the law of the Roman Empire, when confronted by Judaism and ultimately by Christianity, after long periods of persecution, of course, nonetheless grew to accept a kind of diversity.
Absolutely, and it's worth reminding ourselves that Judea is one of the problem provinces of the Roman Empire, but they are given special rules. There are exceptions made around conscription, around emperor worship, around the coinage, around Sabbath observations, that the Romans sort of bend over backwards to try and make these sort of slightly awkward people who have different opinions to the rest of the empire function within it. So yes, this is a profoundly ancient thing within the legal structures of the empire, as well as its practical application of its power.
And the recognition by Constantine, on a very personal basis, of his acceptance of Christianity as a faith. There was nothing there that was formal and institutional, as it were, as a toleration of Christianity. It's just that he stopped persecuting Christianity and it allowed the old paganism to, kind of phrase, to wither away on the vein.
Absolutely, and you do get people like Julian the Apostate. You do get attempts to reverse that, but Rome essentially realizes that a program of active persecution is no longer practical, and it's as much. I mean, we can talk about the fact that Constantine is converted in heart or whatever, but fundamentally, when it comes to the reality of this, it's about practicalities for the empire and how it functions that make this a necessity.
Then in the Christian Western European Middle Ages and its confrontation with Islam, there are long episodes of, well, if not official toleration, then at least a kind of a grin and bear it attitude towards other religions. I would suggest.
Yes, and it's very interesting that when persecution happens, again, this is one of the great myths. People sort of focus in on the Inquisition or on the role of the church. Realistically, the Catholic Church is one of the great protectors of religious minorities in the Middle Ages, where you see violence against minorities, in particularly against Jews in England, or on the back of some of the Crusades in places like Germany and France. Invariably, it's the actions of the mob, sometimes led by the lower clergy or by disgruntled lower nobility, but very rare is it. And England, in fact, is an interesting exception to this, but it is very rare that you have the church, capital C, or the king, capital K, engaging in active violent persecution. Now, of course, there's discriminatory law, but actually, generally, that is in part to secure safety and to secure the management of religious minorities, as opposed to sort of oppress them. There isn't this idea that, we are living in medieval times, people are living in a feudal context where everybody is, alles in Ordnung, everything is in its place, and people have structured society. Now, fundamentally, we still have structures and ghettoization. We just claim that we don't.
Ghettoization, the Venetian ghetto,
Indeed.
and the beginning of the toleration of the Jewish minorities in Europe. I think we should fast forward a bit towards the pretty unremittingly intolerant attitude of Islam towards other religions, which is, after all, one of the great features of contemporary Islam.
Yes.
This, again, is very, very ancient. There are episodes, much lauded by some modern liberal commentators, of Islam being tolerant of Christianity, especially in the Iberian Peninsula, in and about the year 1000 AD. But it strikes me, looking at it, that the evidence is quite strong for a generation or so.
Yep.
And then once you have these fanatical Berbers coming in from North Africa and establishing themselves, there's a really brutal lack of toleration for the rest of the Middle Ages in Spain.
Again, it's one, as you say, it's one of the comfortable myths that we like to tell ourselves. People say, "Oh yes, toleration did exist, but it was Islam that was tolerant." Anybody who is a scholar of the medieval Mediterranean or the early modern Mediterranean will be able to tell you that is nonsense, and that partly goes back further. That Judaism is a religion that is spread by genetics, by blood, by birth. Christianity is a religion that is spread by proselytization, by Paul convincing people. Islam, from its start, is a political religion. It is necessarily one with geographical changes, political changes, social changes that happen across Arabia. And so to divorce it from the kind of political state is a sort of theological impossibility.
Now, one of the reasons why we attach such importance in the forum to the research program we run on Reformation consequences is that it may have some contemporary application in terms of bringing more sense of context and depth to the contemporary debate about Islam. How Christianity learnt to tolerate other religions, and quite as important a fact, how did Christianity learn to tolerate its own internal divergences?
Yes.
And I think the Reformation really gave a big boost to certain varieties of Christian intolerance. And then do you think it fizzled out? Or did people just get bored with killing each other? Which is surely one of the main reasons why toleration starts to establish itself.
You look at a country like Germany that is riven in the 17th century by unimaginable violence. The story. There is a reason why Grimm's fairy tales are so violent and horrible. The nature of this cannibalism, child murder, massacres, rape. This was the norm in Germany for a whole chunk of the 17th century.
People who should know better frequently use medieval as a disparaging adjective for all of this. Nothing within those 800 years in the West parallels what happened to Germany and across great areas of Western Europe in the 17th century.
Absolutely.
Not just the 30 Years' War, but the preceding wars of religion so-called, in France.
And in the Low Countries, and there is an increasing scholarly opinion to view the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the English Civil Wars, the British Civil Wars, as an extension of those conflicts, as a sort of British version of that. I was reading an article the other day, and you'll have to forgive me if I forget exactly who it was, but the scholar was arguing that Scotland in the 17th century was like Afghanistan under the Taliban. The level of tribalism, the level of religious fervour, and essentially the persecuting nature of the religious state there, we can only think of it in parallel to the Taliban in terms of its extremities.
Well, it's when you have a root and branch version of Calvinism, associated with all the supposedly mystical and beautiful charm of clan life.
Yes, yeah, which was blood feuds essentially. Yeah,
and
there's
that
no two
is
ways about
Afghanistan.
it. And that is, and actually, the Afghan comparison is not a flippant one. I think it makes a lot of sense. But fundamentally, I think
With the turban taking the place of the kilt. Perhaps.
exactly, yes, that's perhaps it's matters of dress rather than anything else. But what you do get, I think you're right, that fundamentally Germany ceases to function. We talk about the Peace of Westphalia as a kind of triumph of Richelieu into Mazarin's kind of statescraft.
The beginning of the new international.
Exactly, the
European
idea
order.
exactly, it's the precursor of the European Union, all that stuff. I don't really think that's true. I think fundamentally they've just run out of blood and money.
Yes.
there's a basic thing where look at Sweden gets involved in this and sweeps in incredible victories of Gustavus Adolphus, but they lose. The numbers of men, this tiny European state, the population of Sweden at this point is minuscule. Their king is killed, members of the nobility are killed. You are essentially decapitating these states.
Now, this is true of the external relations between states in Germany. Very vociferous, internally divided nature of the German-speaking area, to give it a term. But within these states, of course, one of the things that promotes eventual inclusiveness is the great principle of cuius regio, eius religio.
Yeah.
Who's king, whose religion. You go with the religion of the ruler.
Exactly. And we see this wherever diversity has actually functioned, practically, religious diversity in particular, it has necessarily involved a strong state, a strong central, almost always individual figure. Almost always individual figure. Even the republics, we think of Venice. The Doge still exists as a theoretical central point of the state. And that almost always, again, that central figure has a confessional identity. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan is a Padishah. He is an Islamic. He is a caliph. He is an Islamic religious leader first and foremost. If you look at England, the established church, the head of the supreme governor.
Now, this for me, you see, is one of the big problems about the way in which so many people talk about diversity and inclusion as if somehow they meant the same thing.
Correct.
And once you get diversity, then you're also going to get some kind of inclusion within this liberal, secular new order. And I think this is just not true.
Well, there's a slightly patronising, I would say it's actually a colonialist attitude that says, oh, well, if we just invite people in and they see how wonderful our liberal values are, they will abandon everything and just come on board. And of course, we just know that's not true. It's an exceptionally, it's either a very arrogant or a very naive, or probably both, worldview that, oh, well, life here is, it's linked to the triumph of capitalism, it's linked to the triumph of liberalism. Well, our life is so wonderful. You can come over, you can pick someone up from a completely different world with completely different beliefs, indeed antithetical beliefs, and they will see how wonderful this is, and they will come on board within a generation.
The extent to which modern Islam, like most of medieval Islam, is founded on a really deep root and branch rejection of the liberal, modern, secular world, a recognition of that truth seems to be almost entirely absent from so many people who are now protesting around here about what's happening in Palestine. Quite right in many ways, to protest against the terrible ravages inflicted on the Palestinians. But the idea that a greater acceptance of what Islam actually means in terms of regulation of daily life seems to me bonkers.
Absolutely. Well, I think the problem is that modern liberalism cannot escape its Christian roots.
Well,
and
it's the fruits of
Pauline roots essentially, and about the individual, and it has this idea of how the individual engages with the state and how the individual engages with his beliefs. And the two of those can exist separately. In Islam, that simply does not exist.
Well, the idea of a fundamental human right, fundamentally alien to the Greco-Roman world. The idea that you're born with rights that are inalienable and rise above the boundaries of culture. No Greek, no Roman ever thought in this way. Plato didn't think this. Aristotle didn't think this. Very interested in the variety of human customs and so on, but the absolute fundamentally normative nature of Greco-Roman civilization is what is so marked when you read the ancient writers on, and so wrong so perverse to introduce notions of modern liberalism in all its individuality.
Absolutely. And to think, as we said, whilst the modern concept of diversity and inclusion does go back to the functional diversity of the Roman Empire, its theory is completely different to the theory behind why people would say they are in favour of diversity and inclusion now. The idea that is what, Claudius means when he is being faintly nice to the Britons or the people of Judea or whatever is gaga. It's coming from a completely different worldview. The practicalities might be similar, but actually the theory is completely.
Let's think about the nature of contemporary modern Christianity, by which I mean from the early 19th century onwards, because for the whole of these 2 centuries and a bit, I think the Christian Church, and specifically the Catholic Church, is in a huge funk about the French Revolution and its consequences, and the intolerance of the French revolutionary regime. This is the first explicitly anti-Christian regime of modern times. It attempts to substitute its own religion, with its own festivals, the Festival of Humanity,
Cult of Supreme Being,
Cult of Reason, Being, and even little religious communes being set up in order to.
Well, they shape the calendar. This is sort of Maoism before Mao.
Oh,
this is year zero stuff. Yeah.
Now, what to do, how to react against this form of intoleration forces the Catholic Church into its own extremes of lack of toleration, especially in the evident, I think, most radically in the First Vatican Council.
Yes.
And the rejection of the modern world, too good.
Absolutely.
The fruit of liberalism, secularism, and all the rest of it. By the end of the 19th century, there are more interesting impulses beginning to make their way within the Catholic Church, and especially in the great encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, concerning new things, new affairs, new events. And here is the Roman Catholic Church beginning to arrive at a kind of understanding of modern business, modern capitalism, and seeking a kind of accommodation with it, but also wanting to harness those energies to its own understanding of the gospel in the modern world.
And it's very interesting because what essentially you have the thinking of perhaps the most important religious institution on the planet, over a billion people adhere to it, Roman Catholicism, the Catholic Church, is essentially shaped, its reaction to capitalism, to the rerum novarum, to the new things, is largely shaped by the domestic politics of Italy. Yeah. By the fact that you have, Pius IX sitting there in the Vatican at the First Council, sort of doing the equivalent of putting his fingers in his ears and going la 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 as Rome itself is invaded.
Having started as a great liberal, of course.
Indeed, and seen which is interesting, and there's comparisons with later popes who begin as liberals and actually
forced by events
not to be. Not alone in that, but what he essentially he then proclaims, and future popes, Leo continues this, the nihil obstat, the idea that we are not going to take part in the modern Italian state. It is not something that we are going to engage with. It is not good for Catholics to engage with. But of course, what happens is, having ruled out 95% of the population of Italy from engaging constructively with its government, actually the early Italian state is pushed into the hands of radicals, of radical liberals, of sort of nascent fascists, and of borderline anarchists. And so fundamentally you see things, and you see this happening in France as well, things like the Concordat, the abolition of...
With Mussolini.
Well, later on, but you get in 1905, I think, in France, you get the abolition of any links with church and state, the religious...
Well, let's not forget the importance and nature of modern French social thought in its Jacobin tradition, as it re-emerged at the end of the 19th century, and its persecutory nature towards church institutions.
Absolutely. Well, it's no coincidence that
intolerant and centralist.
Yeah, and violent if needs be. So this idea that there's this idea that we have now that the secular state is necessarily a neutral space. For the vast majority of history, that has not been the case. Secularism has necessarily meant the eradication of, the communards. There's a reason why in 1871 they shoot the Archbishop of Paris.
It's the abolition of variety.
Yes,
as a school of thought.
Yeah.
It's the abolition of any kind of truth that goes against your own partial truth.
Correct.
But you mask the partial nature of your truth by saying, oh, it is the neutral space. It is the secular space.
Yeah. But secularism is the opposite of diversity, because it necessarily involves exclusion. It is not inclusive. It is necessarily exclusive. And again, forgetting its origins certainly its origins for Western Europe in the French Revolution is catastrophic. And when we think about the emergence of how political parties have worked in Europe, and specifically think about the emergence of Christian democracy, as we're talking about in a consequence in Italy, it's basically saying, well, this is the alternative.
Well, Christian democracy, big social theme, big political theme in the middle decades of the 20th century, and emerging into very powerful political groupings in Germany and in Italy. You can see some remnants of it in the Partido Popular in Spain as well. And a fusion, it seems to me, of what in Britain we'd call a pretty left-wing view of economics, advancing trades unions, accepting capitalism as the least worst possible option for the running of a modern business economy, but saying, look, the state and individuals, they have their rights within that context as well. So controlling it, and that's the basis of corporatism as a social philosophy, while at the same time, and these are very contemporary terms now, being much more right-wing and conservative about social issues of sexuality and
this is something that as a brief aside, the Anglophone right, particularly the Anglophone right at the moment, as they sort of regroup in this country in particular, what they have got so catastrophically wrong is there's this idea that capitalism and social conservatism go hand in hand. That's historically that is absolute bunkum. It's not.
It's absolutely
true.
Perverse.
It's perverse. It's the opposite of what you see going on across Europe, and sort of the idea that because of Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the Anglophone countries operate differently is nonsense. We'll get on to in a minute, I'm sure. As to why there isn't a Christian democratic tradition in England in particular, and Britain more generally, but there is this fundamental problem that the right is still deluding itself into the idea that liberty is going to naturally lead to freer markets, freer people, but we can also keep it.
Let freedom reign down the ages. Tear this wall down, and then it will be great.
And it's just not true. And actually, European political parties, as we've said, have historically got more of a handle on this.
Let's not forget just how successful, electorally speaking, Christian democracy was in Italy in the post-war world, just after 1943-44, when the party is formally organised and recognised, and all these big names of Giulio Andreotti emerged to preside over periods of great economic growth in Italy. And the CDU in Germany as well. Party of Frau Merkel.
Almost permanently in power
since the war. And in the way of many political parties now just have collapsed very suddenly, very completely. Like bankruptcy, as somebody once said. I think Ernest Hemingway, how did it happen? He said to a friend of his who had gone bankrupt, he said, at first very, very gradually, and at the end, suddenly.
Yes, and
that's what happened to Christian democracy in Italy.
Partly victims of their own success, of course, because the great elephant in the room here is, of course, the European Union, which is a
and the extreme importance of Catholic social philosophy for the European Union.
A famous quote, of course, I forget who said it, was the reason why the British hated the European Union is because it was devised by three things they hated: German, Catholic, intellectuals. and those are three things that Brits
and the extreme difficulty that advocates of the European Union in Britain had when they were told to parrot the word subsidiarity. From the days of the great debates of the Maastricht Treaty onwards, subsidiarity meaning that you have to take a decision next to the local level possible, and then up it goes. Highly abstract view of the nature of power.
And going back to the Holy Roman Empire, essentially. And lest we forget, the people who have been in senior... At the moment, we have a German baroness as the, senior commissioner. There was a Habsburg running the European Union for a long time.
Yes.
Its roots into the whole world that we've just been talking about, of kind of Catholic diversity, of Christian democracy, is inherent. And perhaps the collapse of those parties on a national levels of Europe is perhaps a reflection of just how successful they've been in moulding the continent.
Well, the von der Leyen, the family that Ursula married into, they were big in the 13th century.
Yes.
In the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I mean, they make Windsors look like Johnny-come-latelys, as it were. But here's a big thing. Why is it, do you think, that Britain did not have a tradition of formally recognised political parties calling themselves Christian Democrats? You'd think, when you look, for example, at the history of the Conservative Party in its days as a broadly central party of government, Butskelism then emerging as a doctrine in the 1950s and 60s, pretty reminiscent of an awful lot of Christian democracy in Italy and Germany. And yet we don't have that. Now, could it be that one reason is that Britain did not have any kind of version of the French revolutionary agitation?
Absolutely. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that so much of this is sort of the part of the Catholic Church's reaction to the political facts of the French Revolution. The political facts of the French Revolution, whilst, and that goes back to what we're talking about Anglophone failures to understand this, the political facts of the French Revolution never became reality here, which is why British and American liberalism can so glibly wish to replicate the secular values and liberal values, etc., without realising what that takes in practical, political, violent terms, because it exists only in theory. And so therefore the reaction only ever existed in theory. I mean, you do get, in the government of Lord Liverpool or something in the early years of the 19th century, a degree of fear. There's the Cato Street conspiracy. There's an idea that we have to, a reactionary crushing down. But that isn't quite the same as what then emerges in the later 19th century. Does Disraeli do an element of it with the property-owning democracy? But arguably the thing is that in Britain what has always mattered more is property. You have the party of property versus the party of labour.
And the great importance, seems to me, of Australia, the penal colony to which you can ship out all your really difficult people, and radical agitators and Irish predominantly,
and
leaving this island of security and blissful prosperity.
Lest we forget, before that, we did that with America. Who do you send in the period 1610 to 1680? You send your maddest people, the people who are incapable of existing within what is actually, in terms of Europe, a very tolerant and broad religious settlement.
Poor old Italy and Germany, they don't have the equivalent of Australia.
No Australia, no America, no place to send your crazies.
Now France hoped to have something like that in Algeria when it started to export people from the 1830s and onwards. But that didn't work out too well, really.
No,
and the consequences of that are with us to this day.
It's sort of fascist and it's sex pest, as far as I can work out, as we'd said.
But the absence of a formalised Christian dimension to political activity is a very important part of the British success story, really, in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the fact that the identity of the churches themselves are so strong, they don't really need to be politically organised in an association with a political party.
Absolutely. And indeed, the establishment of the Church of England, it's almost impossible to, I think, to overstate the importance of this, that it's almost acted as an inoculation against religious politics in Britain. That fundamentally what you have had is the sort of counterintuitive establishment of a particular church. And we can talk about models of de facto establishment, such as fundamentally, for the vast majority of Welsh 19th century and into the 20th century political history, nonconformity was functioning as
the establishment.
It was the establishment. It was politically established. You go to parts of Glasgow today, and the Roman Catholic Church remains the political establishment.
But that's an organisation, it seems to me, of physical space.
Correct.
There are certain places within Glasgow, certain places, obviously still within Belfast, that are Catholic or are Protestant. That's a different recognition of that.
It is. Cuius Regio, Eus Religio, again.
Or indeed like the millet
system,
in the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
that lasted for such a very long time, and was a formalised recognition of local government and units within those local governments that had their own religious
But
identity.
those can function, to go back to what we said at the very beginning about the Roman Empire, about the Ottoman Empire, and about the unique British setup and the English setup, perhaps more specifically, is that those can function in their pillars, in their millets, in their, call it what you will, in their communities, because there is this central figure who is not theoretically neutral, but bestows tolerance from a central point. And if you have, as you do in France, the theoretical state being neutral, theoretically being secular, actually that provides an awful lot more room at the level underneath for disgruntlement, for unrest, for violence and for tension, as we are seeing in France right now. And yes. I would be astonished if we're recording this just as the Olympics begin. I would be astonished if the Olympics go without some form of religious-related violence or rioting happening in France. I just think that seems to be the norm in France over most summers, frankly.
The great Olympic ideal of fraternity and sorority on the field of track.
Yes, quite. But it's there is. I think Britain is necessarily different in that regard because it never had to deal with the realities of the French Revolution.
And the lack of a racist or gene-determined theory of nationhood or nationality. Because nationality in England, in Britain more generally, is founded on not a notion of racial harmony or racial identity. It's founded on obedience to the institutions of government. Predominantly, the established church, many of the disestablished churches, non-conformity, and the king and queen.
And we have continued to add to that, poster board of institutions. I mean, now I would say, what do people require from someone in Britain? Loyalty to the National Health Service is arguably, the thing that is required to what makes us proud to be British. Number one is often the health service. So we kept on doing that even as we have sort of perhaps moved away from. But they are deliberately broad institutions. We sort of in some ways owe this concept to the first great Elizabeth. It's the Elizabethan settlement politically and religiously is essentially about saying, look, you're not going to get on. Let's make this middle bit as broad as we possibly can.
Yeah. Let's not build windows into men's
hearts. Exactly. And just, if you can sign up to it, great. We'll leave you alone. Now, if you can't, well, that's a different matter. Yeah. But that has been the kind of model that Britain has tried to maintain. And arguably, that's fraying at the edges at the moment, I would say. It is fraying. I think that is weaker than it has been for a very long time. But that's always been the model.
Though I would say that on the case of Elizabeth I and toleration, she does go a bit nutty on Catholicism in the 1580s.
She does.
And when the Church of England, or that ecclesiastical version of the state that she had, becomes extremely persecutory. But then, the poor old girl, she was reacting to having been excommunicated, which takes a lot of a wind out of one's sails, I rather fear.
Although it took the literal wind out of the sails of the Armada, I suppose. So, yes, but what's interesting there is when I think the British state has acted like that, it has always been in response to foreign or external pressures. We're talking about, you look at the government of Lord Liverpool, the repressive governments in the early 19th century. You look at the Catholic persecutions of the 1580s. You look at actually the Popish plot, etc., in the late 17th century. These are always in reaction, real or imagined, threats. They are in reaction to those threats, real or imagined, that are external and seem to threaten the establishment of that order. Be that.
And quite a lot of the reaction against the Oxford movement in the 1840s and 50s is a result of a fear, not just of Romanization, but a fear of the foreigner.
Absolutely. It's foreign, it's different. And you can trace that into fears at the moment around political Islam, etc.
Yes.
It is essentially, but what the strange thing we now have is, of course, those people who would claim they are liberal, tolerant children of the French Revolution are actually trying to sort of co-opt that very well established and actually very complicated British toleration to say, we've always been like this. Yes, but for different reasons to France or Germany or Italy.
So there, with the survival of the old English Ancien Regime, we now march forwards towards the Olympics and see what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely.
Let's look forward to our next podcast.
I won't be wearing a Phrygian cap, I promise.
I hope not. Thanks for listening. Do join us for the next of this series of podcasts. For more information about EF's research and publication programme, go to www.erasmusforum.co.uk.